Thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar on the water system, storage, and drought outlook. I'm going to introduce Kalsum Abbasi. Kalsum has been with Colorado Springs Utilities since 2009. She is the supervisor of the water conveyance team, which is responsible for managing and moving water in the 25 reservoirs Colorado Springs Utilities uses for its water supply, as well as yield forecasting and administration of the city's water rights.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. So tonight, what I'm going to go over is kind of a basic background of the water supply system, Colorado Springs Utilities water supply system, your water supply system. Then I'll talk a little bit about current drought conditions and our water supply outlook for this year. I'll go into a little bit of drought response and how we at utilities deal with our water situation when we see that things are drying up like we have last year and this year. And then I'm going to wrap up with Waterwise Rules, which are part of our new water shortage ordinance, new as of last year, and really, let you know what that means for you. But on this map, here's I-25. Colorado Springs is right here, so we're at the confluence basically of Monument Creek and Fountain Creek. And we have a pretty extensive list of reservoirs, or a series of reservoirs in and around Colorado Springs. So around Pikes Peak, we have 3 systems. We have the Northfield system, of which Rampart Reservoir is our biggest reservoir, and then there are 2 smaller ones below that, Nichols Reservoir and Northfield Reservoir. And then on the north slope of Pikes Peak, if you drive up to the top of Pikes Peak, you can see our 3 reservoirs up there. So we have Crystal Reservoir, South Catamount, and North Catamount reservoirs. And then on the south slope of Pikes Peak, we have a series of 5 more reservoirs. So let's see if I can remember them. We have Bighorn, we have Wilson, we have Beamer Reservoir, Mason Reservoir, and McReynolds Reservoir. And as of several years ago, the public actually can go up to South Slope on the weekends. There's a permit system through city parks that allows folks to go up there and go fishing and hiking on the weekends in the summertime. So I'm not sure when that's going to open up for 2021, usually about June, but that is open to the public as well. And it's beautiful up there, so I do encourage folks to get up there if you ever get an opportunity to do that. So those are our main local reservoirs. We do have a series of smaller reservoirs and then quite a few river and creek diversions on Fountain Creek and its tributaries. But given the number of reservoirs and diversions that we have locally, a lot, especially of the reservoirs, have a pretty junior priority date. And I'm not really going to go into the priority system, Colorado's water rights laws in this presentation, but I do want to mention that briefly in Colorado, we are under what's called the prior appropriation system, which means you have to have a right to use water in this state. So water belongs to everyone in the state, but the right to use it is actually a private property right. And so while we have all of these water rights, well, I should back up and say that the way it's been set up over the past 150 years or so is the first people or entities to make use of water were able to claim that right, and they basically get first dibs on water in that stream system. So while we have several reservoirs locally, a lot of them have fairly junior rights, and they're not actually in priority or allowed to store for most of the year. In the wintertime, things relax a little bit, and several of our reservoirs can store. But mostly what we use, especially on the Northfield system and the North Slope system, what we use those reservoirs for is what we call terminal storage. So that's where we bring water from other stream systems closer to town and stage it for treatment. And we do that via a series of pipelines. Before I get to that, though, I just want to move downstream a little bit, move down Fountain Creek, point out Pueblo Reservoir. We have a couple of pipelines that come up from Pueblo Reservoir. So we have the Fountain Valley Authority pipeline that's been in existence since the 80s. And then we have our Southern Delivery System, which was put into service in 2016. So Pueblo Reservoir is a large reservoir, as you probably know, and we do store a lot of water down there. We don't actually have any water rights in Pueblo Reservoir. So while we store quite a bit of water down there, we're not actively collecting water in that particular reservoir. We do have shares in the Colorado, Lake Henry, and Lake Meredith companies, and those are further downstream, down the Arkansas River. So we have that canal system starts diverting just east of Pueblo, the town of Pueblo, and stores water in Lake Meredith, which is actually down near Ordway, Colorado. So that's also a fairly junior set of water rights. We do store a fair amount of water each year, but because it's so far downstream, so far east of our system, we don't have any way to directly pump that back to town. We depend on the river to move that upstream, and we do that by what's called a river exchange. So really briefly, and instead of using that as an example, I'm going to move upstream here, up the Arkansas River. So we have storage in Turquoise Lake, which is near Leadville, and in Twin Lakes Reservoir. We are also shareholders in the Twin Lakes Reservoir Company. These are actually both U.S. Bureau of Reclamation facilities, but we do have storage. So when we want to exchange water, move it upstream, what we basically do, and the river conditions have to be right to be able to do this, but we'll store water out of priority. Again, we don't technically have a right to store water in, say, Turquoise Lake, but we will release a like amount out of Pueblo Reservoir to make up what we're shorting the river up here. And so it's a really effective way for us to get water, say, out of Lake Meredith, way downstream into Pueblo, or even all the way up the Arkansas River if the conditions are right. It's a huge tool that we use. It's really very important. So, if we weren't able to do those trades, which is essentially what they are, imagine trying to pipe water all the way up the Arkansas River. It just wouldn't work. So we rely really heavily on that system to get this lower Arkansas River water up into our system where it's useful to us. So let me talk about the system up here. So we collect quite a bit of water from the west side of the Continental Divide. And so this kind of faint dotted line here is the Continental Divide. Our first system, which is the smallest, is the Blue River Collection System. And that is just on the other side of Hoosier Pass. Just as you drop down the pass, we actually have some collection systems on either side of Highway 9 up there. We have Upper Blue Reservoir, and then we have Hoosier Tunnel. So we're able to bring the water that we collect each spring and summer off that system through the tunnel, and it goes into Montgomery Reservoir, which is on the South Platte River, and it's just basically this side of Hoosier Tunnel. So if you're driving up the pass, you can actually see Montgomery Reservoir kind of off to the west when you're on the highway. From Montgomery Reservoir, and this schematic doesn't picture it or doesn't show it quite correctly, but we have this pipeline that actually comes not out of the tunnel, but out of Montgomery Reservoir, and it pipes water from the Blue River system all the way to our terminal storage on North Slope. Because Montgomery Reservoir is such high elevation, we actually transport all this water by gravity. So there's not a single pump involved in that, which is huge for us. It's not our biggest collection system, but the fact that we don't have to expend any energy to get that to town is, it's pretty important to us. So that water typically will come into the North Slope system. We do have the ability to transfer at the Twin Rock Pump Station and send it to Rampart Reservoir instead if we want to for operational purposes. So that's the Blue River system. And then kind of moving over from there, we have the Home State Collection System. So this is a collection system that we share with the City of Aurora. We're 50-50 co-owners with them on that project. And Homestake Reservoir sits just on the other side of Tennessee Pass. It kind of sits on the Pitkin and Eagle County boundary. But again, we collect water there. We have another tunnel, the Homestake Tunnel, that we can pipe that water from that side of the divide to Turquoise Lake and store it there. And we have a special account just for Homestake water in Turquoise Reservoir. The Fry Ark collection system isn't one that we own. It's a Bureau of Reclamation project that's managed by the Southeastern Colorado Water Conservancy District. But we are beneficiaries of that. So we do receive an allocation of water from the Fry Ark collection system each year. So they collect that and also pipe that into Turquoise Lake. But we actually don't take possession of that water until the Bureau brings it down the Arkansas River to Pueblo Reservoir. So that's really our biggest storage bucket, if you want to call it that, in Pueblo Reservoir, is Fry Ark project water. And that's historically what we pumped through the Fountain Valley pipeline and why the Fountain Valley Authority pipeline was built. But we also can pump that through the SDS pipeline. And then finally up here we have the Twin Lakes collection system. And that is one, I mentioned this before, we are actually shareholders in that reservoir company. We're the majority shareholder, but we don't own it. So that is, as this title would lead you to believe, the Independence Pass collection system is just on the other side of Independence Pass. We have a series of collection structures that will pipe water to Grizzly Reservoir, and that's on Lincoln Creek. You can actually drive up there. There's a small campground up there and lots of hiking. And then there's Twin Lakes Tunnel, which brings that through to Twin Lakes Reservoir. So Twin Lakes Reservoir is important to us because that is where our major pump station is. So we share, along with the city of Aurora, the Otero pump station. That's part of the Homestake project. And we pump most of our Trans Mountain water, Trans Mountain meaning coming from a different water basin, really across the mountains. We pump that water via the Homestake pipeline through Twin Rocks pump station typically to Rampart Reservoir. But again, if we need to, we can switch and send some of that to the North Slope of Pikes Peak. So this really is a pretty critical supply for us. We pump on average probably 50 to 55,000 acre feet of water per year. An acre foot is roughly the size of a football field. A football field is roughly an acre. And imagine that filled with water to the depth of 1 foot. That's 1 acre foot. And typically we say that 1 acre foot can serve a typical household, or 3 to 4 typical households for a year. So to put that 55,000 acre feet in context, Colorado Springs total demand has been running about 72 to 75,000 acre feet per year for the past several years. Excuse me. So these two pipelines and these collection systems on the other side of the Continental Divide are pretty critical for us. And I'm going to show that on the next slide. So this is kind of an average water yield for the past several years from our major systems. And everything with these light blue water droplets are a Colorado River source. So Fry Ark project, Twin Lakes, Homestake project, our Blue River collection system adds up to not quite 50% of our supply each year. But because we're importing that water from another basin, we have the right to use and reuse that water to extinction. And so that's what this pie slice here with the darker blue dot or water droplet is. That's representing, we call it exchange to Pueblo Reservoir, but really that's the reuse of our Colorado River supplies. So when you add that all up, that's close to 70% of our water supply that comes from the Colorado River, which means those systems are really critical to us. The pipeline infrastructure, the collection infrastructure is very important to us. Issues on the Colorado River and kind of the drought discussions that have been going on the past few years, the worries about water in Lake Powell, and eventually possibly shortages in Lake Mead. All of that is something that we watch and we participate in, discussions relating to that very closely because these water supplies are so critical to us. And they're critical to us because, as you know, Colorado Springs is not on a major river. We're on Fountain Creek. We do have some fairly senior water rights on Fountain Creek, but they're just so small that, it's not nearly enough to supply the city with water. And that's been true since, the turn of the last century, even before that. I think the late 1800s, the city leaders were already looking to build systems on the south slope of Pikes Peak and the north slope of Pikes Peak. Those Colorado River systems really are our bread and butter. And a lot of what my team's job is actually tracking all the water we use from the Colorado River through our system, back out our wastewater treatment plants, down Fountain Creek to Pueblo Reservoir so we can reuse it again. And then moving that water upstream back up to Twin Lakes Reservoir so we can pump it through our system again. So I put together an outlook once a month, so all this information is hot off the press. I on the first of each month, pull drought information, water supply information, and pull it together so that we can see how our system is doing for the month and what the outlook is. And that's really critical this time of year as we're looking forward to runoff. So this is the Drought Monitor. It's provided by the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they monitor drought across the United States. So this is what the state of Colorado is looking like as of this Tuesday. So El Paso County, of course, Pueblo County, here's the Arkansas River, here's the Colorado River. So just a few months ago, pretty much the entire state was red. It was in those extreme drought, exceptional drought conditions. The big storm that the Front Range had in mid-March really has done a lot to help us in eastern Colorado. And El Paso County has improved. It's relative because we're still in moderate to severe drought, but we've improved quite a bit since the beginning of the year. But unfortunately for us, the Colorado River Basin is still seeing extreme and exceptional drought conditions. That recent snowstorm just didn't really extend to the western part of the state. They've been lagging behind in snowpack, and I actually have a couple of graphs that show some of that in a little bit more detail. But let's first look at the entire state of Colorado snowpack. So again, you can see eastern Colorado is actually doing fairly well right now, near average. The Arkansas River Basin is slightly above average. The South Platte, where we take a small amount of water at Montgomery Reservoir, is at about average as of yesterday. The North Platte's been doing all right, but again, the western Colorado river basins just are lagging behind, below 90% of average. The Upper Rio Grande is doing very well. We don't take any water supply from the Upper Rio Grande. So when we're doing our yield forecasting in the springtime, we're really focused, of course, as you can imagine, on these Upper Colorado Basin snow tell sites. That's where we get this information, snow telemetry sites. And then to a lesser extent, we look at the Arkansas River. So we do have water rights. I mentioned the Colorado Canal Company, Twin Lakes and Turquoise Reservoirs up in the Upper Arkansas actually do have their own storage rights, and we do own some of those. Turquoise we own straight up, and then in Twin Lakes, just by virtue of being shareholders in that company, we do have access to water through that company. So at times when there's a lot of snowpack, a good water year in the Arkansas, those reservoirs will come into priority to store, usually during runoff, and we're able to pick up a little bit of water in each of those reservoirs. But it's not a sure thing in the spring and summer in either of those reservoirs. And even though the Arkansas River is doing fairly well as far as snowpack goes this year, stream flow forecasts are actually not doing as well, basically because the soil is so dry that it's expected that a lot of the snow melt will actually go into the ground rather than make it all the way to the rivers. So these are running, snowpack is running about average. Stream flow forecasts, and we're waiting for the April forecast, but it's running more like 80% of average, so quite a big difference there. So this is a graph of snow water equivalent in the Arkansas River Basin, and as I just showed you, it's at 105% of normal. This dark blue line is tracking our snowpack to date, and you can really see where the storms of the past couple weeks have really helped boost that snowpack. And this puts our current snowpack in context with median and average snowpack for the year. The lowest that we've ever seen, and this lighter red line here is 2002, so you can see that the end of the season of 2002 was the lowest that the Arkansas River had ever seen. And then this darker blue line is the highest snowpack for each date ever recorded. 1997 was a pretty big year that we used to index to, and so that's shown on this graph as well. And here's the upper Colorado River Basin. So again, below 90% of average. Again, this puts this in context of median and average, lowest ever recorded, highest ever recorded. And you can see that really in the past, I don't know, month and a half or so, snowfall's it's been about average because it's kind of tracking parallel to this line, but it's just early in the season. That basin dropped off so much that it just hasn't been able to recover the past couple of months, unfortunately. So what does that mean for us? Well, part of what my team does is yield forecast, and we do that each month from February through June, looking at not just snowpack, but also streamflow forecasts, and we basically compare that to previous similar years as one way. We also will do a mathematical regression as we do two different forecasts and just try to predict what we think we're going to get. So for this year, we did the March 1st forecast. I won't get to the April forecast probably until next week, but on March 1st, we predicted that we'd probably get about 78% of average yield for this year. So, and I have up here that average is about 115,000 acre feet per year. So again, putting that in context of our demand, Colorado Springs demand is roughly 75,000 acre feet per year right now. So in an average year, we'll actually pick up more than that in our system. But this graph shows you how variable our yield can be from year to year. So 2021 is looking pretty similar to last year. 2018 was similar, maybe a little bit worse. I actually expect that this April 1st forecast will come up just a little bit. But 2019 was a perfectly average year. 2014 was a big year. So we have quite a bit of variability in our forecasts from year to year. And this graph shows our reservoir storage. Excuse me. And this is our total system storage. So all 25 reservoirs that we track our water in are represented here. This brown line, I'm sorry, my pointer is lagging a little bit, but this brown line here is 30-year average storage and how it tracks throughout the year. So as you can imagine, in the spring or before spring runoff, our storage is kind of low. This kind of uptick represents runoff, and then we draw down throughout the summer as our customers demand water, and so on and so forth. So for this, currently, as of the end of March, our total storage is at 72% of capacity, and that's just a little bit below the long-term average. So average for end of March over this 30-year period that we're tracking here is about 74% of capacity. So we had a pretty good demand last summer. It was pretty hot and dry. Our yield forecast will probably be, I mean, as you saw in the previous graph, it's kind of tracking similar to what we got last year. So, you know, we'll come up to maybe 80%, maybe hopefully slightly above 80% of storage, and then start to drop down again, would be my guess. Excuse me. The other thing to take note of this, or on this graph for later in the discussion, is this dotted red line. So this dotted red line represents a year and a half of demand in storage. And how we calculate that is we take the previous 3 years of our customers' use and average that out and call that a year of demand. And then these lines just track, where 1 year of demand storage would be, the lower gray dotted line. This red line again is 1.5 years of demand and storage, 2 years of demand and storage, and as of the end of March, we are at 2.6 years of demand and storage. And we'll discuss that 1.5 years of demand and storage again later and why it's important. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to drought response then. So when we see that things are getting dry, conditions are getting dry, maybe our yield is not going to be as good as we hope, and we maybe are getting a little bit low on storage, we start thinking about drought response. And so these are the goals that we have as we're thinking through these situations. Number one is to minimize impacts to our customers and also to our own resources. What that really refers to is going into watering restrictions. We know that that's really hard on our customers. It's also hard on us as a utility. It's just a lot of extra work. Enforcement is a lot of work. Monitoring is a lot of work. The lead up to declaring restrictions is a lot of work. So we really want to make sure if we make that call that we're making the right call. So we spend a lot of time in the spring kind of getting ready or looking at things to see if that's really what we want to do. Do we really want to call on drought restrictions? So when we're making those decisions, we look at a lot of things. So it's the long-range weather forecasts. It's the snowpack and precip and stream flow that I've talked about. Temperature conditions, evaporation and evapotranspiration, so how much are plants using? What are the soil moisture conditions looking like? Our projected storage levels are hugely important. And then just any other operational constraints that we may have going on. Do we have a reservoir outage? Do we have a pipeline that's down? Those are things that are very important, as you can imagine. And then, this is really more on the other side. As we're coming out of drought, we want to take advantage of any drought recovery options that we have once things improve. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a future slide. So let's start with demand side actions. So this demand side is how our customers use water, basically, and how we can influence that or are forced to influence that if we need to, if conditions require. So for this year, because we knew last fall that things were not looking great as far as last year's drought and the forecast, because we were in a La Nina year, heading into a La Nina year, a lot of times that sends snow to the north and doesn't really send it to our collection systems. So we thought we better get on our drought response plan and update that and make sure we're ready to go if we need to really hit the drought response hard. So we did that over the winter, got that done. Last time we had updated that was in 2013 when we went into watering restrictions then. We also decided that for this year, we just want to make sure that we're reaching out to our customers fairly regularly, and we'll see this ramp up as we get into the irrigation system or season. Just reminding folks about our Waterwise Rules, which I will talk about later. Seminars or webinars just like this, just educating the public on our system, things that they can do to help, things that they can do to keep their landscapes healthy with a minimal amount of water. Just kind of reiterating those messages, reminding folks that we do have resources here to help them. All that's really important. The next three are in italics. So if we decide that we need to go into watering restrictions, that's a pretty big effort, like I mentioned before. Along with that will usually come water savings goals. So we'll decide, how much do we need to see these watering restrictions save over normal conditions. And then, of course, enforcement is a part of that, and it's very resource intensive for us to do, but something that we need to do when we go into watering restrictions. And then along with all that, of course, is just monitoring and evaluation. How are our systems doing? How are our customers responding? really what is our water supply looking like given all of the actions that we're taking. On the supply side, so this is the water supply side, there's some things that we do, and really all of these are things that we do every year. It's just that when we're in drought response, we really focus on them. We really make sure we're diligent about staying on top of them. You know, instead of looking at river conditions and snowpack conditions once a week, we're looking at it pretty much every day and just seeing how things are trending, reading more, meteorological reports. What are things looking like? What are the predictions, climate predictions for the next 1 to 3 months? We really start hitting that hard. So maximizing local storage is just making sure we get water as close to town as possible. In the event that anything goes wrong or things dry up, we want to make sure that we have our water as close to our treatment plants as possible. Optimizing use of our local creek diversion. So the creek rights that we have on Fountain Creek, we have some on Cascade Creek, on French Creek, kind of off of Pikes Peak there. Ruxton Creek, we have some water rights, North and South Cheyenne Creeks. We really want to maximize the use of those when we can, because it protects our water that's in storage. Every drop that we're taking directly off the creek, we don't have to pull out of storage. And all of those water rights are what are called direct flow rights, which means we can only take them and send them directly to treatment. We can't take them and put them in storage. It's not legal. So we really want to make sure that we're using as much of our creek water as possible so that we're protecting our storage in case things don't improve as quickly as we want. I talked about river exchanges, and reservoir trades are basically the same thing, but we trade water with another entity on paper to get water upstream to basically to Twin Lakes and Turquoise Reservoir, so we can get it pumped back to town via the Otero pump station, Twin Rocks pump stations. And then watershed protection. Of course, in drought years, wildfire risk is higher, so we want to make sure that we're ready to respond to that. We have our own fire team here at Colorado Springs Utilities, so they're keeping an eye on conditions and making sure that they're ready to go as soon as there's even a hint of a situation on any of our watersheds. They're on it. And we also have a watershed protection group that year in and year out are working to thin forests and just make sure our watersheds stay healthy. And then in the cases where we have had fire, such as the Waldo Canyon fire, which affected a couple of our systems, they're the ones who really get in and do the hard work of recovery and getting grants and kind of just doing the on-the-ground stuff that we need to do to make sure that the water that is making it to our creeks and to our reservoirs is as clean as possible. Drought recovery options. So again, this is, once we get through a drought year, there's some more snowpack. When our storage has taken a hit, we really want to recover that storage as quickly as we can. So we have a few ways we can do that. The first, and the one that we've been working really hard on the past 5 or 6 years, are agricultural leases and alternative transfer methods. And we actually have a separate program that's just some staff who are devoted to making agricultural leases and these ATMs work. So we went in with the Lower Arkansas Water Management Association and purchased a bunch of shares from that group, and we've agreed to split them 50-50. So 5 out of 10 years we will take the water off of those shares, and the other 5 years that water will stay down in the lower Arkansas Valley to be available for agricultural use. So we bought those shares in 2018, and then we also executed a lease with the Super Ditch Company, which is a little bit different in that we don't own anything in that system, but what we do is just lease water from them, and the Super Ditch Company actually goes out and finds farmers who are willing to forego irrigation for a year so that we can take that water and put it into storage. And so we got that lease. We signed the lease a couple years ago, but we got approval from the state to do a lease project in 2019. So the plan right now is to execute both of those in 2022. Hopefully conditions will increase to the point where, or will improve to the point where we can do that and we can get some good water off of both of those. But right now those are our main plans for drought recovery. And then sometimes there are other surplus water leases. So other water entities that we work with may have surplus water just given how their systems operate, just how large their collection systems are compared to their need. Sometimes we can lease a little bit of water off of those different entities as well. So we'll be looking at that next year, hopefully, as we recover from dry conditions this year. So let's move on to the water shortage ordinance. So this was passed at the end of 2019 and went into effect last year. And it describes two different types of shortage. So we have hydrologic shortage, which is pretty much what I've been talking about. And then there's emergency shortage. And that's, just unforeseen things that can happen at any time. So we're focusing on hydrologic shortage. So what the ordinance says that if total system storage is projected to be below 1.5 years of demand on April 1st, then we start analyzing and trying to decide if we need to enact water restrictions. So this says April. We really start looking at it, in January. And so I showed you that graph earlier of our total demand and storage, and I pointed out the dotted red line at 100 or 1.5 years of demand and storage. We really don't expect that we'll get down that low this year. It really would take probably an emergency situation for that to happen. So we don't intend to enact any water restrictions this year. But the shortage ordinance does lay out 4 different shortage stages. So I'll go through those real quick. It's a lot of information on one slide. But what we can do is declare what's called a stage 1 shortage, which is a watch. And I will say that I'm talking about this a little bit out of order. So after this, we'll start talking about Waterwise Rules, which will put this in a little bit more context. But basically, if we declare a stage 1 shortage, what happens is we'll hit our messaging a little harder, and anyone who's irrigating on our non-potable system, so that's the purple pipe system, it's raw water and or treated reclaimed water that goes on a loop through town that certain entities, basically in the downtown area, can irrigate off of, or commercial customers who have their own irrigation well. They're forced to decrease to 4 days a week, and there's some exceptions to that. Stage 2 shortage, we have 2 levels of that. So level A, we would decrease potable irrigation, so basically sprinkler irrigation, to 2 days a week, and there are some time limits. So depending on what sort of sprinkler system you have, whether it be drip or regular rotary heads or whatever, there's some time limits to the amount of time you can run each zone. So that gets decreased to 2 days per week, and I'll talk about what that gets decreased from in the next couple of slides. And then the non-potable system irrigation gets decreased to 3 days a week. If we go into stage 2B, that gets potable irrigation is decreased to 1 day per week, non-pot to 2 days per week. And then there are a few other things that get called into play here. So restaurants can only serve water upon request. If you have water features, you can only use them if they are recirculating water. Several other things that are listed out in the ordinance that happens if we're in a stage 2 shortage. Stage 3 is severe. That's where we stop turf irrigation. And the statute or the ordinance says that we're allowed to water trees and shrubs only, and only 1 day per week. And then some other things that might happen, indoor industrial and commercial use starts to get restricted a little bit if necessary. Car washing is prohibited, a few other things like that. And then stage 4 is a critical shortage. Irrigation is limited to trees and shrubs only, and only 1 day per month. And so each of these stages do assign days when you're allowed to water based on address, things like that. And I will talk about where you can find that ordinance if you're interested in reading it at the end of the presentation. All right, so with that, let's move on to the Waterwise Rules, which are also part of the ordinance. And these were enacted really as a regulatory means to curtail the waste of water. So what it did, the key thing for our customers to know is that it made permanent our 3-day per week watering rules. And so that's what we would decrease from if we declare a shortage. So as of 2020, we're only watering 3 days per week, and our customers can pick which 3 days per week they want. There are no days assigned, but you can only water 3 days per week. Used to be voluntary, now it's involuntary as per the new ordinance. And the reason we did this is there are multiple reasons. So, setting limits on what all of our customers can use kind of evens the playing field and just kind of keeps things fair for everyone. We really wanted to instill a conservation ethic because water is scarce in Colorado. We know that, we're seeing that, seems like more and more each year as drought continues. So every drop we can save now is a drop that we don't have to go out and find because the city is growing, in case you hadn't noticed. So, right now we have enough water to cover our customers' needs, but in the future we're going to have to go out and find more water. And if we're going to do that, we need to be able to demonstrate that we're using our water to, as wisely as we can. We can't be wasting water and then going out looking for other sources of water to support our growing city. So that really was the impetus to rewrite the rules, and there are several other rules, which I think are on the next slide. Yes. So 3 days per week, and between May 1st and October 15th, you can only run your sprinklers before 10 a.m. or after 6 p.m. And of course, that's to try and avoid evaporation in the heat of the day as much as possible. You're not allowed to let water pool or flow across the ground. If you notice a leak on your system, you have 10 days to address that. If you are hand washing vehicles or your lawn, you can still you can hand water your lawn. I don't believe that's restricted to 3 days per week, but you do have to have a shutoff nozzle on your hose. And then avoid using water to clean off driveways and sidewalks, things like that, unless there's some sort of health issue that could arise if you don't actually use water to clean things up. But we just want to avoid, spraying a bunch of water on concrete is not beneficial. So that's something to be avoided. So with all that, we also wanted to make sure that we developed a few programs to help our customers who maybe can't stick to 3 days a week of watering. So I'll talk a little bit about these. The first is a water allocation plan, and that really is for customers who are just, with their existing landscape, still have trouble sticking to 3 days a week. It just doesn't quite work for the amount of landscape they have or the number of sprinkler zones they have. 3 days a week isn't going to work for them. We also have establishment permits, and so that's if you're installing new landscape. Could be sod, could be shrubs, and again, you want to make sure that you get those established in the best way possible. There's a permit you can get, so you're not limited to that 3 days per week. And neither of these have a cost for the permit. So let's talk a little bit about the water allocation plans. What these do, and I will admit I'm not the expert, so if we do get questions on this, I might pull in Catherine to help. But what these do is, if you have a really complex system, like I said, or a large system, where you just can't run your sprinkler system effectively and get everything watered within 3 days a week, what we'll do is we'll work with you, we'll get information on your landscape, and basically allocate an amount of water that you can use between May 1st and October 15th. So I believe it's 24 inches over the surface area of your property. You still can't use your sprinklers after 10 a.m. before 6 p.m. You're still subject to all the Waterwise rules, but it just allows you to spread out your water use from 3 days a week to more days a week if that's beneficial to you. So anyone can apply for that. I kind of talked about large landscapes complex sprinkler systems, if you happen to have very sandy soil, you may need to water more than 3 days a week. And there's a form that you fill out. If you have a contractor who helps you with your landscaping, they are able to, with your permission, can do that for you, and then get all the information about your water allocation plan so that they can put that to use on your property. So if you're interested in that, that's on our website. You can also send an email to wap@csu.org. But until you get that plan, you are limited to the 3 day per week watering. And I'll throw up our websites again at the end of the presentation if you want to take note of that. So an establishment permit, like I mentioned before, is for new landscapes that just need some extra water to get them established. So you get more than 3 days per week, and you can also water in the middle of the day if you feel it's necessary. So that 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. restriction doesn't apply if you have an establishment permit. So this, again, is for anyone using sprinklers to water new grass, sod, seed, or landscape plants. If you're hand watering, you're not limited to the 3 day per week rule to begin with. So you're free to do that at any time. But if you're using your sprinkler system and you want, or you need extra water, then you do need to get an establishment permit. So drip irrigation is also exempt. Like I mentioned, the hose end watering is exempt. Any hand watering is exempt from this. And again, we have information online, and the email address for that is estp@csu.org. And I believe that those permits go into effect today, April 1st. Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the intent anyway. So we're starting to get into irrigation system or season. So finally, for anyone who happened to be on last week, we had an introduction to the sprinkler system. So this is just a reminder. Really use your sprinkler system to best advantage. Follow irrigation schedules. Take full advantage of your scheduling. Putting in a little bit of money to improve your system really can pay off in your landscape. And you know that we really want that as a utility. We want to make sure our customers have healthy landscapes and don't feel like the restrictions that we have make it impossible for that to happen. So we do have a lot of resources. We have these courses, we have these webinars, we have irrigation rebates. So this is an important one too. If you do want to improve your system, really take advantage of the rebates that we have. More information on that on our website and at waterwiseplants.org. You can kind of, if you're thinking about maybe replanting, you can go look and see what sort of plants do really well in our system, or in our, what is the word? I've blanked. In our climate, there we go, in our climate with minimal water, and also look good, which is important. So that is all I had. These are some web pages that you may be interested in. I will say, if you just go to csu.org and use our search, there's a search up in the top right. You can type in water system, and it will kind of give you the background of our water system. So those first couple of slides that I showed. We have the Water Supply Watch webpage, which is my monthly outlook. So it talks about current drought conditions and what our reservoir storage is looking like currently. And then there's a Waterwise Rules page. So that will get you information on what the rules are, how they apply to you, if you need permits. All that information is linked there.
Kalsum, thank you again. We appreciate it. And everyone have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everyone.